I think one of the great things about these networks is like you do everything you can do, and then if you do it well, the next person just has the ball a little further up the field and they can try to do that.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and I am recording this fresh back from Fiber Connect in Nashville. We're going to be holding on to it for just a little bit until it publishes because we got a couple of interviews set up. But I was excited to find a time to speak with Seth Weiner, the former CIO for the city of Newark, New Jersey. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Thanks, Chris. I'm super happy to be here.
I'm excited to speak with you. You've done some really interesting work, and I would say that we were remiss in not publicizing it. We put a lot of effort into it, and every now and then it comes up, and we're like, oh man, we still never finished that thing off. We just got to get it done. And I wish that was the only project that we had let sort of fizzle, but I feel like a lot of people are not aware of the cool things that Newark was doing when you were there, and I think you get a lot of responsibility for that. But I'm always hesitant because I feel like people are always quick to say that they're part of a team and whatnot. But why don't we start with just telling us a little bit about the time that you were in Newark from 2013 to 2018? I feel like Newark was in a bit of a renaissance, and tell us a little bit about what Newark was like in that time and what you were dealing with.
Newark has historically been the largest city in New Jersey for, probably 200 years. It's been a very long history. And Newark has always been very well situated, meaning it is at a confluence of the major railroads, the highways, the airports, the seaports. And so for a lot of reasons, historically, over the last, 200 years, Newark has been the first in a lot of things. As an example, the Morris Canal that used to come through the Delaware River kind of snakes its way through New Jersey and ends up in the Passaic in Newark. So there's old pictures of Prudential with these bridges going over canal, I guess, tributaries. I don't know what to call them, but like really amazing stuff and really cutting edge, 1880, 1870, 1850. And so when I was in Newark in 2013, it was towards the end of then Mayor Cory administration.
Cory Booker, current senator, but renowned mayor at the time of Newark.
Yeah, I had actually been in D.C. and my wife and I are from New Jersey, wanted to get back to New Jersey. And I remember thinking or saying to her, gee, the only thing I'd want to do is go work for Cory Booker and do tech. That would be so cool, So by sheer luck, that worked out. And it was clear from talking to some folks in the business community, even before I started, I got a call from the deputy mayor, Adam Zipkin, who now works for Senator Booker in Washington, D.C. He says, what do you know about high-speed internet? What do you know about fiber optics? And, I said, I don't know a whole lot. Let me start learning. I think I bought IBW's simple manual on like fiber splicing because I was big on the IBW at the time from some earlier campaign work. Obviously, that was not exactly the subject matter we're going to talk about.
But helpful to know.
Yeah.
Gives you a little bit of confidence.
Yeah. And I think also we're probably not going to cover all this, but the labor aspect of building our own networks in America and doing things for ourselves. And you've kind of been a really big advocate of this. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle generally, that the internet isn't something magical that falls from heaven like manna, right? The internet is just neighbors connecting to each other, and then those communities connecting to all the other communities, and ultimately doing all the wonderful things we do. Right now we're working, we're going to school, we're entertainment, all that. So it was an interesting transition moment in 2013. There was a clear interest in high-speed internet. There was not an understanding of what that would mean. But maybe to put some more context on it, I think it was 2009 that Chattanooga had got the award from the American Recovery Act in 2009, 2010, and started to build out fiber using their electric utility.
Let me just add a little bit of context because I think it's important. They started building in, I want to say like 2008, 2009, and then they got the award like a year later, and that significantly sped it up. It's important for people to know that they had started building even before the economy cratered, or they started planning, and they had the contracts in place to build before the economy cratered. And so they were, doing their own thing before the federal government stepped in to help them do it much more rapidly.
Yeah, talk about shovel ready, right? You're like really right there.
Yeah.
And they did, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about a $300 million all-in piece with 100 from the feds and 200 locally bonding against the revenues from their electric utility.
Yep.
And so that was a really giant splash in the pool, I think, for anyone at a city at that point. And the challenge quickly became, how do we replicate that without $300 million?
And you probably would have really noticed it because it was on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal at different points within like 18 months.
It was big enough that people who didn't know, people that weren't expert in high speed internet was like,
Mm-hmm.
well, Chattanooga did it. It was like a lot of that. And I would, Chris, you and I have talked about this stuff over many years, over 9 years or so, but I always look at the historical examples of like what played out. And so, I would say to people, well, the Tennessee Valley Authority allowed for local control of their electric utility. And that's the legacy that we now see 100 years or so later. So it's not, these things don't happen by accident, I guess would be the other
Mm-hmm.
point. But Newark being where it was really lucky or fortunate, or, however you want to frame it, with the canals, with the railroads, with the highways. A lot of the fiber backbone for the East Coast was going through Newark. And identifying that, understanding how telco hotels kind of fit and where they are and all that really helped, at least at the first stages, understand what the value of the city already, what value the city already had before I was even, trying to apply any program or think about it. Just understanding the infrastructure. I got great advice from a mentor, Dan Tangerlini in DC. He was an administrator for the city of Washington, DC. He was later GSA and Treasury. He said, find the guy who rips up the roads. That guy's going to know everything. And that's great advice, I think, for anybody working for a city. Find your traffic engineer, your head of traffic. You're gonna find these legacy systems, and you should learn about them because you could have insight into what's going on. And I think, Chris, it was you who turned me on to Santa Monica about what was going on the West Coast. I think we probably connected around 2014, if I had to guess. And Jory Wolf was then the CIO of Santa Monica, and they were doing kind of a piecemeal build model, which is great if you don't have $300 million. And trying to understand that and trying to understand how it fits together brought us to a program in Newark called Newark Fiber that's still around today and about to, if I could conjecture, probably going to expand very rapidly. It's about 100 buildings right now. And the goal was how to build things out in a way that would be generally self-funded. There wasn't a lot of credit available at that moment to kind of do this stuff, unlike now. And I think the key for us in Newark was understanding existing assets and going into a hybrid model. The wireless world was really moving fast, and 30 gigahertz and 60 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz backup stuff. This was a really interesting moment when the wireless gear was going from $30,000 point to point to, at the end when I left, IgniteNet was like $600 a side for 1.2 or 1 gig duplex, which was great. And so that really enabled us to think really creatively about how can we use the fiber we have in the ground, how can we run new fiber, and how can we offer connectivity to buildings with the real goal of having the lowest possible price, right? Driving the price low, especially in a city like Newark. You're doing it for economic development purposes. You're doing it to bring in new tenants. You're doing it to bring in new businesses. And there are a few really shiny success stories of each of those things happening. There was one example of a downtown apartment building going up called the Haynes Building, which was in a very old, elegant department store called Haynes that my wife's grandmother was from Newark. My bedroom furniture is from Haynes. And the Telco Hotel is actually in the old Bambergers. Bambergers invented the Macy's Day Parade and later sold to Macy's. So it's very funny to have, modern internet coming from one old department store to a new department store with close to 200 luxury units and a whole bunch of affordable. And we basically were able to offer gig internet for a very cheap price in that building because the developers of the building were able to do this in a piecemeal way and say, okay, instead of signing a contract that locks us into one vendor, let's put in vendor agnostic fiber within the multi-dwelling unit within the apartment. And if Newark fiber is the best price and the best thing people want, that's great. But if another competitor wants to offer service in that building, that's fine too. There's no legal, problems there. Of course, we know the end of that story, and generally that public interest networks are going to offer a lower price because that's their goal. And that building was really successful. There were a few other ones like that. And then from the business side, I used to joke, we're going to try to, this will attract new businesses, or I would say it, but I don't know to what extent I believed it. And we really ended up attracting several really big new businesses. So Panasonic was moving in. I don't think that was really a big driver for them per se, but M&M Mars came in and they were on, their buildings on a 10 gig pipe. And Broadridge is a financial services company, and they came in, and I heard that the internet and being at, a 10 gig pipe that was a reasonable price for them was a big driver too. And there have since been others. There's, film studios moving to the area. And so the markets for high speed internet in 2013, 2014 might have been, people were more influenced maybe by high speed trading. That was, some of the stuff going on there. But nowadays, especially in the creative sector, you're talking about shared, video and editing and architectural drawings, and really a lot of different market segments benefit from very cheap, very high speed internet. Mm-hmm. And hopefully that'll continue to be a driver of Newark's growth and economic development going forward.
Yeah, because I feel like there's a couple of things. One is I want to make sure people are aware. Newark isn't just a large city in New Jersey. It also has a lot of buildings that are well above the trees. So that gives you assets that you don't always find in other cities that are more spread out. Your downtown is quite large. Another thing is that you have that proximity to New York City, and so you have benefits with that. And I feel like it's one of the lessons that I've seen is when you make that fiber available. You might not have a company that says, "Well, we're just going to move to Newark because of the fiber," but they're like thinking about Newark. It's made their final list, and it's a sweetener that will help them get over and also help retain those who are maybe on the fence about whether they're going to move somewhere else.
Perhaps the greatest, the greatest claim to fame of the network was that we were like number 2 or number 3 on that giant Amazon HQ2 bid. Mm-hmm. Having the high-speed internet was a real outsize card on the table that applied well to this type of thing and the idea of a tech company coming in, perhaps for better or for worse. I don't know the right answer to that one, but we're also Newark, to your point, one of the densest cities in America, right? It's only all of a sudden, it's about 300,000 right now, according to the census, maybe 308, which is not, super big, but it's like 25 square miles. It's very small. And if you carve out the airport and seaport, which really isn't land that's usable, you're at like 20 square miles. Mm-hmm. So it's very dense, compared with Chattanooga. I think Chattanooga was like 300 square miles or something of that nature.
And their electric territory is like 700.
Yeah. So there's differences, and there's obviously tremendous differences in cost per mile build. In an area like the South, you could be dealing even in rural parts of the Northeast, you could be dealing with $30,000 a mile or less. And in a city like Newark, especially if you're cutting a sidewalk, you're talking like 120, 150,000 a mile. So one thing, actually, I would also just say, coordination of utilities is a real crazy one. And, it used to drive me nuts every time I saw a sidewalk being cut and I didn't know if there was fiber going in for later or PVC pipe going in for the next guy. And I tried so hard to coordinate, and I probably could have done better, to be honest, about getting that. But that's a real challenge to public interest infrastructure, is just the sheer difficulty and coordination of, you have an electric utility, you have a water utility, you have private construction, you have private telco operators, and everyone just kind of goes into the road, does their thing, does their cuts, and it's brutal. And the lack of coordination is really, really tough, as is, frankly, the physicality of it all. The idea that once you do the paving and the milling, if you're going to do a cut, and I got to go curb to curb, these are challenges I think that we as a society should work on, because mm-hmm. ultimately it'll pay dividends in the out years. But one example, Sidewalk Labs thinking about how can we do modular pavement? How can we do these things in a different way that allows for new utilities to go in? These are all, I think, big picture challenges that, if anyone's listening who's in the public sector, these are things that I think that you should put your shoulder to the wheel and push as hard as you can. But I'm also open to smarter, more long-term thinkers structurally solving some of these challenges of cutting once, even if you're just trying it experimentally with an ordinance, cut once and try to have some sort of coordination office. I'm seeing Jersey City, for example, established director for infrastructure. There's ways of kind of centralizing or increasing the chances of productive overlap.
Yeah, one of the things that's come up in my friendship with Travis Carter, and I know that you were talking before we started recording. You're familiar with the Connect This series and some of the work we do talking with smaller ISPs and really innovative folks. And it was interesting to me because I was always under the impression that you'd rather save the expense to go in an open trench. And from his point of view, And I think that it's a common but perhaps not overwhelming point of view, because different operators have different priorities. But he hates that, because then you're on someone else's timetable, and he likes, being able to be very efficient with his crews and not have them penciled in for a day and then finding out someone else screwed up and you can't get in that day and you're scrambling. And so he always likes to go in right after everyone else is done and the sidewalk's done, and then he does directional boring, so he doesn't do a lot of cuts. But I gotta imagine it's pretty aggravating for the street folks to have someone that prefers to go in right after the street is finished.
And like I said, I always analogize to history. And I used to say to people, this is the Wild West. Like, this is the complete Wild West. Like, there's no law saying that so-and-so has to do it in this sequence and that person has to. Even if there were a law, there's no enforcement mechanism and no one cares, and I would find infrastructure all the time and say, what is this? What's the permit for that? What's the permit for that? Or I'd find, companies would go bankrupt over time, which is totally fine. You and I were talking about this.
Yeah, and
Go
their
ahead.
attachments are still up there, right? Like that's when I started getting the pictures for the telecom Peekaboo. One of the first ones we had, I was like, "What is this thing?" And they're like, "It was probably retired. It probably hasn't been used in 10 years, and no one's taken it down."
One thing that I thought it was Jory, but it might have been someone else. Let's give him credit for now. When you think about cutting once, they would have a fee that would go in on the developer's side, and then the city would do the work on laying the pipe. So there wasn't as much scheduling. But your point is very valid, which is the friction of trying to coordinate simply prevents us from coordinating. And I totally get that. It's just a long-term goofy problem that if we could solve, we could probably be in better shape.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about that, I've been a big fan of what we have here in Dakota County, which is a solution that bubbled up from the folks actually doing the work, which is a permitting system in which you can get alerts and when someone else is working in the right-of-way. But I can imagine that there might be an elegant way of implementing that in a low-touch way, but I would imagine that many places that might try that would find that they're just inundated and no one actually reads the alerts because they're getting 100 of them a day.
And one of the nice things about fiber, of course, is you could just run 4-inch PVC everywhere and leave it for 20 years, and that's a win in some context, right?
Well, especially with like the microducts that are available now with you can put in these big pipes that have a lot of ducts within them that then you can parcel out.
Absolutely. And I just also, while we were chatting, I looked up quickly. Newark is as dense as like Philadelphia and Chicago at about 11,000 plus people per square mile. So not every city could follow precisely what we did with a wired wireless approach, but it is very attractive. And even at the time, let's say 2015, I was hearing a lot of arguments that directional point to point in a busy city would be very noisy and it wouldn't work in a city like New York. But I'm seeing now in 2022, the evolution of certain types of hybrid networks in New York City as well, which is great. And I think that this also underscores another favorite soapbox of mine, which would be that the unlicensed spectrum is really, really, really important. And the idea of point-to-point wireless, I always say the evolution of unlicensed spectrum tends, in my opinion, to mirror the evolution of licensed spectrum. So when you moved over to 4G, when 4G really proliferated and you were getting 50 megs, 80 meg speed tests on a phone, that was around the time that 802.11n and AC sort of evolved. And as 802.11ac evolved and you're getting, 200 megabit speed test inside, that's really terrific. And as you're moving into 5G, you're seeing advances on AC, you're seeing advances in, I'm not even as current as I'd like to be with all this, but the idea of higher and higher MIMO combinations and ways of making the speed on the phone through unlicensed spectrum reach 400 megs, 500 megs,
Yeah, even with, I feel like Wi-Fi 6, we're looking 6E, I think we're looking at multiple gigabits potentially. For a phone probably can't handle that, but some of our devices can.
Right. We were doing, this was just comedy. This is 2016 or so. We were trying to show off, and if you go to newarkfiber.org, you can see this. We were trying to do the fastest speed test on the internet, and I couldn't find any speed tests above 1 or 2 gig. Mm-hmm. We were really getting in the weeds here. We're like, okay, well, the firewall is fine. That's not the problem. The switch is a 10 gig switch. That's not the problem. And then we realized that in order for the computer to do a speed test, it was downloading a file. And we had a write to disk problem where computers simply couldn't write to disk at that kind of speed. So there was a new Mac that had just come out that could write to disk. It was a solid state drive and it could write to disk at 4 gigs. So we did a 4 gig per second speed test. And we, at the time that was the fastest speed test you could find available on YouTube. So it's the background right now of newarkfiber.org.
That's awesome. I feel like we should be very clear about what you did in Newark. So you connected buildings, and some of those are commercial buildings. Some of those have residential tenants. But just the what's the 30-second version of what you actually did?
30 seconds, I would say I established a legal framework, which is really important, like governance. Second is I established our expectations around profit and loss. So I established a business case. And then third is I established what were going to be our tech standards to meet the business case. And I think those three things, you can get different people to do it. You can get one person to do it, whatever it is. You don't have to, doesn't have to be all in one. Those three buckets for us were extremely critical to getting things off the ground. You need a firm legal footing. You need an understanding of cash flow and what's really going to happen. And with that goes also selecting an ISP and figuring that out.
So you didn't act as an ISP at all as Newark?
No, and I would frequently say the city itself would not act as the ISP. And I would frequently say, because that would make the lawyers extremely nervous. And I would say, we're not providing IP addresses to anybody. We are enabling a market exchange to happen that today can't happen. But we're not, no city employee is provisioning IP addresses and creating subnets and all this other stuff. Like, we're just going to get someone to do that. That's okay, though. It's on them. And there's tremendous, from the telco acts of 96 and 2006, there's tremendous flexibility, right? We see this with, you can't hold Facebook accountable for problems, but on the flip side of that is an ISP providing internet, there's not a whole lot, aside from the issues with copyright law, there's not like issues with what people are looking at on the internet. It's pretty wild west, to use that metaphor again. So that was kind of bucket two. And then bucket three was getting into the tech space, which we did together with, a lot of people who are smarter than me. But, I would experimentally get into these, we looked at microtrenching for a while, talked to Mark Hudson in Detroit. And I said, Mark, what's your experience with microtrenching? He said, if I could do it again, I wouldn't do it. So instead of getting into that, we kind of tried to work around it. We did these point-to-points. We did Vubic was a good point-to-point solution for a while. IgniteNet didn't come around until about 2-3 years into the program. We experimented with a lot of other products. There's a product called Wi-Fiber. There was a hope of like omnidirectional to point to multipoint, which I still think would be a really powerful game changer for a lot of these things. So those are the three things I did that I think almost any city could think about, governance, profit and loss, and the actual tech you're going to use. Chris, can I give one quick shout out? A friend of mine who helped build the network actually passed away a few years ago. Chris Pakunis, he was the CEO of Gig Zero, and they were an early kind of profit sharing partner with the city's nonprofit. And it's also just goes to show also, like, you don't have forever to do these things.
I think that's important. Yeah, I just learned, one of the people that taught me a lot and built a wonderful network in Southwest Minnesota, Dan Olson. I just recently learned he passed not too long ago. And then at Fiber Connect, we were honoring Gene Scott, who was just a terrific person and really did a lot. So yeah, there's people who, you recognize that they're getting older, and then there's other people that you're just like, whoa, that person,
Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
we gotta get good stuff done.
I think also one of the things, not that all your listeners are seeking glory and eternity, but I think one of the great things about these networks is, like, you do everything you can do, and then if you do it well, the next person just has the ball a little further up the field and they can try to do that. Like our traffic engineer, Jack Nada, who headed up the traffic division in Newark, was very smart and put in a lot of fiber while he could. And there's a tremendous, strong network with good splices, and all that. And Jack passed while I was there as well of colon cancer, I think. And I just remember thinking, like, wow, Jack, if you hadn't done this, I don't think if he hadn't gotten me to second base, I don't think I could have scored by making the way home. So it's really important just for everyone to understand, like, that's, from a civic perspective, that's the relay race. It's a big, what you provide, Chris, which I'm extremely thankful for, is this like think tank element of helping connect the dots between folks like me and folks who are doing other work and kind of pulling those things together. And without the intellectual gravitas and kind of research layer that you provide to this story, again, a lot of people would be starting from the very beginning. And I don't think that's not easy. It's hard to do that in a lifetime, to start from scratch and run forward.
Well, I appreciate that. We, our team does this best, and it's an exciting place to work. But I want to be clear. So you identified the three things that, from a city perspective, you had to do. I want to know what that resulted in, and that resulted in basically getting connections to more than 100 buildings, either by basically fiber in through the main level at the ground, or wireless at the top, likely point to point, that would then be distributed within the building. Did the city own the distribution cables within the building then? Did you have like contractors that put those in? How did you handle that?
The city didn't own stuff in the building. The city retains ownership to everything outside in the street. The city does not own the point-to-points, but the city owns any fiber that gets built as a result of extending the network. So that all retains ownership with the city. The city then leased from a legal framework. Everyone can do, depends what your state laws are, depends what your city laws are. But I opted for going with leasing all the fiber under local land and building law. You can go different directions, right? So under local land and building, you can lease a public asset like that to a nonprofit for a public purpose. And the city has a nonprofit that it utilizes for economic development, as do many, right? So like think of New York EDC or anyone else, like that. And then the nonprofit became the contracting vehicle to procure an appropriate partner ISP, to procure, own the contract that said a building wanted to be connected, to own and develop elements of the terms of service that the vendor would ultimately then provide to the customer. So there's a lot of arm's length work going on there, which I think is sometimes good. There's other ways of doing this. I think there are ways of centralizing it and doing it through a city. If I could do it all over again, I don't know that I would follow the exact same governance model, but this at the time made the most sense to me. It also is very logical now there's a lot of financing out there from banks, from the feds, from everybody. And to have it owned and leased for X amount of time by the nonprofit allows the nonprofit to be the vehicle that would then take on debt. Although an individual ISP probably could do that too. I think there's benefit to kind of centralizing those things. So that was the basics are, it's like a 26 plus mile network that the city owns. There's a lot of point to point and a lot of rooftop rights that are legally probably with the nonprofit, that when a customer signs up, the nonprofit has paper, and we developed all this stuff. We didn't do it from scratch, but we what does a form contract look like and how do these things evolve? And we sought anchor tenants and we figured out, who are going to be the very earliest adopters who are such city boosters that they're willing to try this, shout out to like Prudential, Audible, and Panasonic, who I think were probably the first. The Prudential Center is a customer. They have a video game. They have a video game like league.
E-gaming.
Yeah. They're on like a 10 gig pipe. So like, that's cool,
I think Chattanooga got some of that action too for the similar reasons. So as we're running out of time, what are some of the challenges that we haven't talked about that people should be aware of?
I think the first biggest challenge is like an ideological challenge, right? And I think that it's important, Tom Piketty's second book on capital really gets into this. Like the ideology and the story we tell ourselves is really important. And it prevents, as an example, the idea that the city shouldn't be providing internet prevents creativity. It prevents like people thinking about, do I deserve to pay less than $80 or $90 for an internet connection? Can I pay $20 for an internet connection? And certainly next to me in the CIO's office, there was a water utility, and the water utility for Newark. Newark has historically the greatest water in the region. We had many beer manufacturers, Budweiser, Pabst, a lot. Even the Tiffany glass company was using the water for good usage. And that grosses $100 million a year, but no one argues that, we don't have ideologically, it's wrong to provide water. So ideological hangups are definitely the biggest thing, I think, that just gets people going.
Let me just give you a +1 on that, because I think there's really important work broadening people's ideas about this done by an Italian woman, Mariana Mazzucato.
Yes.
Her books are wonderful. I haven't finished the Moonshot yet, but her first two are wonderful, and I've been enjoying Moonshot.
Totally agree. Moonshot is wonderful. I read the other one on the value. It's not like the value of everything.
It's something like that, yeah.
It's like a pun on that. It's very good. It gets into how we describe certain economic activity as value creating and non-value creating, and how that ideologically underpins our thinking. And I think that having those conversations robustly out loud with each other, with students, with the youngest generation. I think also the disruptions that we've seen, right? So internet was not a utility, was not an accepted utility in 2013, but here comes a pandemic and all the kids are home from school. And guess
Mm-hmm.
what? Internet, suddenly everyone's like, how do we get all these low-income people internet? Well, if you had done this 50 years ago, if you had taken this seriously, you wouldn't have this problem now. So it's important to beat the ideology and to do that. The second thing I would say is like the spirit of experimentation, which again, Mazzucato is like really, really good for this. And Chris, I asked you one time in like 2015, I said, why do you think we're just so like not into trying these things out? Like, why is this a problem socially? And you were like, oh, we're not farmers anymore. You said when everyone was I say this quote all the time. I said when everyone was an individual farmer and a piece of equipment broke on your property, you just fixed it. You didn't like debate the issue and like you just got in the tractor and you fixed it. And he goes and you said, and now that no one's farming anymore and everyone's got computers and whiz bang crap, no one has the ethos that we're just going to try to do it. And like failure is a bummer, but failure is not the end. You just figure out how to do it in a different direction.
That sounds wiser than anything I would have said. You might be confusing me with someone else, but I
sure.
love the idea, and I would say that I feel like along with that, it's like not being afraid to break things, right? Like, that's one of the things I'm so careful in raising my son. I just want to be like, all right, at least we're in a place of my wife and I have very modest habits, and so I'm sort of like, I'm gonna give him a shot, and like maybe he'll break this thing and then we'll have to deal with that, but like it's important that he not be afraid of touching things.
Yeah, I totally agree. If I could give a plug to my wonderful wife Rachel, she focuses on a program now for psychological safety and like what that means in the workplace, and she reflects on the stuff I did in Newark a lot, and she goes, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and I said, where? And she said, well, I used to give out an I Broke It award because I'll give you one stupid example. We had a phone system in the city that was costing us like $180,000 a month. And I gave an award for the person who broke it one time. All the phones stopped working for 4 hours, and like somebody freaked out, oh my gosh, the phones aren't working. And I said, yeah, I know it's really a bummer. We'll fix it. They'll be back up. I said, but the phone bill went from $180,000 a month to like 20 grand a month because we were experimenting and trying to make these changes. And I think that, when your home internet goes down, there's plenty of scenarios where I'm like, internet's being a little glitchy or what's going on, and I think that for public sector people out there or anybody listening who's curious about these types of things, that spirit of experimentation. I've been reading a book on the Erie Canal lately. Bernstein, I think, is the author. I could be wrong. And it's like they didn't know how to build a canal, a 300-mile canal. They didn't have a single person in America that had the credential of an engineer. They were digging with their hands. But guess what? They built a canal because, and it was on budget, which is even crazier. So the idea that you can experiment to do things, I think you see in communities where they need to. And I think that one of the real challenges with the affluence in America is we just think everything is as good as it can be and should be, and we're happy to keep pumping profit to people who have it. And that's ultimately not what society really needs. Society really needs like ingenuity, creativity, because that'll create greater empowerment and greater ownership of the collective infrastructure, which will then create better rules for how we do all these things. So I think it's a challenge because we're really in it, but I think that ultimately we can get our way out.
I feel like if I was reading a book on the Erie Canal, I would just not be able to get Bruce Springsteen's version. I can't remember the name of the song, but since you're from Jersey, I figured I would bring it up. But it's like he covered I think it's like an Irish song, and there's a chorus about working on the Erie Canal. And
all right, I'm gonna have to look that up now.
Yeah. It's like, it might be from his Live in Dublin album. So it's which is an amazing album. So that's probably a pretty good place to draw it to a close. Seth, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a great conversation. I think we left a lot on the table. I'm hoping that at some point we're at the same event and maybe we'll just talk about live on a microphone as well. So thank you.
I would like that so much, Chris. And thanks again for everything you guys are doing. I rely on your thinking on this so much. I appreciate that you're continuing to beat the drum and stay focused and continuing to research the questions of the times. I sound a little dated, but I listen to your podcast to figure out what's going on now.
Cool. Thank you.
We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle's @muninetworks. Subscribe to this and other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arnie Hughesby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. This was the Community Broadband Bits podcast. Thanks for listening.